Hello there, I'm Nicholas, and this is On Listening with Chi Rising Studio. Thank you for joining me today. Resistance is a natural part of being human. We all develop strategies to protect ourselves from discomfort, uncertainty, and vulnerability. These strategies become so ingrained that we often don't even recognize them as choices. They simply feel like who we are. But when we bring conscious awareness to these patterns, we create the possibility of choice, where previously there was only automatic reaction. What makes resistance patterns particularly challenging to address is that they operate largely beneath our conscious awareness. Like fish swimming in water, we don't see our patterns of resistance because we're immersed in them. They colour our perception, influence our decisions, and shape our relationships in ways we rarely recognise without intentional reflection. And this is where the practice of deep listening becomes invaluable. When I speak of listening in this context, I'm referring to something much broader than simply hearing sounds. I'm talking about a quality of receptive awareness, a willingness to perceive what's actually happening within us and around us rather than what we expect or would prefer to be happening. This listening extends to our bodily sensations, our emotional landscape, our thoughts and beliefs, and the subtle dynamics of our relationships. One of the most common resistance patterns is avoidance. We are remarkably creative in finding ways to sidestep discomfort. We might fill every moment with activity to avoid feeling lonely. We might intellectualize our experiences to avoid feeling vulnerable emotions. We might procrastinate around important tasks to avoid the possibility of failing. When we listen deeply to these avoidance patterns, we often discover that what we're avoiding isn't nearly as threatening as our fear suggests. Another prevalent pattern is control. When life feels uncertain or threatening, many of us respond by attempting to control everything within reach: our environment, our schedule, our bodies, other people's perceptions of us. This pattern of control often masquerades as responsibility or perfectionism, often making it difficult to recognize. Yet when we listen to what's beneath this drive to control, we typically find fear and a deep longing for security. Resistance also frequently manifests as judgment of ourselves, of others, of situations that don't match our expectations. This judgmental stance creates a sense of separation and superiority that, in the moment, protects us from feeling vulnerable or inadequate. But it also prevents genuine connection and growth. When we listen beneath our judgments, we often find unacknowledged pain, seeking recognition and healing. What makes these patterns so persistent is that they worked for us at some point in our lives. Perhaps controlling your environment was the only way to create safety in a chaotic childhood. Maybe avoiding confrontation protected you from conflict in relationships. These strategies developed for good reasons, and it's important to acknowledge this before attempting to change them. Listening with compassion to the origins of our resistance patterns helps us understand their purpose rather than simply trying to eradicate them. It's important to note the practice of releasing resistance doesn't mean eliminating all boundaries or accepting every circumstance without discernment. there's an important distinction between conscious boundaries that protect our well-being and unconscious patterns of resistance that limit our growth. Healthy boundaries are flexible, context-sensitive, and consciously chosen. Resistance patterns are rigid, automatic, and often inappropriate to our current circumstances. So, how do we begin to recognize and release these deeply ingrained patterns? The first step is developing the capacity to listen to ourselves with genuine curiosity and without immediate judgment. This listening presence creates a space where patterns that have operated in the shadows can gradually come into awareness. Without this foundation of non-judgmental awareness, our attempts to change often simply reinforce the very patterns we're trying to release. Our bodies offer one of the most direct pathways for recognizing resistance patterns. Long before our conscious minds register resistance, our bodies respond with tension, constriction, and discomfort. You might notice your jaw clenching when someone offers feedback, maybe your shoulders hunching when faced with a new challenge, or your breathing becoming shallow when entering certain environments. These physical responses aren't random, they're somatic expressions of our resistance patterns. By developing a regular practice of scanning our bodies with gentle, curious attention, we can become more adept at catching resistance in its early stages. This doesn't require special training or extensive time, just a willingness to pause periodically throughout your day and notice. Where am I holding tension? What is my breathing like right now? What subtle sensations am I experiencing? This simple practice gradually builds your capacity to recognize resistance as it arises, rather than hours or days later. Our emotional landscape also contains valuable information about our resistance patterns. Emotions like irritation, boredom, or restlessness often signal resistance that hasn't yet reached our conscious awareness. When we find ourselves suddenly impatient or inexplicably anxious, it's worth pausing to listen more deeply to what might be triggering these responses. Sometimes what seems like an emotional reaction to a current situation is actually being activated by an old pattern of resistance. The stories we tell ourselves, our internal narratives, offer another rich territory for listening to resistance. Notice the recurring themes and beliefs that shape your interpretation of events. Do you often frame challenges as threats rather than opportunities? Do you habitually cast yourself as the victim or the savior in your relationships? These narrative patterns both reflect and reinforce our deeper patterns of resistance. By listening to these stories with curiosity rather than identification, we create space for new interpretations to emerge. Our resistance patterns also become visible in the quality of our attention. Do certain topics consistently cause your mind to wander? Do specific conversations leave you feeling strangely fatigued? Do particular activities reliably trigger the urge to check your phone or otherwise distract yourself? These subtle shifts in attention often indicate areas where resistance is active. By noticing these patterns, you develop the capacity to stay present even when discomfort arises. It's worth noting that resistance patterns serve a protective function, so attempting to forcibly eliminate them often backfires. Instead, the path of release involves first acknowledging the pattern with compassion understanding its origin and purpose, and then gradually introducing new possibilities. This isn't about aggressive self-improvement, but rather a gentle expansion of what feels safe and possible. A practice we can experiment with is softening resistance rather than confronting it directly. When you notice tension, judgment, avoidance, or control arising, see if you can create a little space around it. This might involve taking a few conscious breaths, physically relaxing tense muscles, or mentally stepping back to observe the pattern without immediately identifying with it. This simple practice of softening often reveals that resistance itself requires considerable energy to maintain. Another approach could be mindfully exploring the edge of your comfort zone. Rather than attempting dramatic changes, experiment with small steps beyond your habitual patterns, whilst maintaining a listening presence. If you typically avoid speaking in groups, perhaps share one brief comment. If you tend to control outcomes, experiment with letting one small process unfold without intervention. These modest explorations gradually expand your capacity to stay present with discomfort. Importantly, releasing resistance isn't something we can accomplish once and for all. These patterns have likely developed over many years and are reinforced by both our personal history and cultural context. Working with them is an ongoing practice of growing awareness and gentle change over time. Each small moment of recognition and choice gradually reshapes the neural pathways that maintain these patterns. It's also valuable to recognize that resistance patterns often intensify when we are under stress or facing major life transitions. During these periods, our nervous systems naturally revert to familiar strategies for managing threat. Rather than judging yourself for regressing, you might view these moments as opportunities to practice self-compassion and to recognize how deeply ingrained these patterns are. Listening with kindness to our struggle often reveals insights that judgment obscures. The practice of releasing resistance ultimately invites us into a different kind of relationship with discomfort. Rather than automatically reacting to discomfort as a problem to be solved, we can learn to listen to it as information to be integrated. This shift doesn't mean seeking discomfort, but rather developing the capacity to remain present and curious when it inevitably arises. This presence with discomfort gradually expands our window of tolerance. Our relationships offer particularly rich territory for both identifying and working with resistance patterns. The people closest to us often trigger our most ingrained patterns of protection. By listening to these relationship dynamics with honesty and curiosity, we can recognize how our patterns interact with others' patterns, creating recurring cycles of reactivity. This relational awareness helps us take responsibility for our part in these dynamics rather than simply blaming others. One powerful practice for working with relationship patterns involves listening, not just to the content of interactions, but to their underlying emotional tone and physical sensations. When a conversation suddenly feels strained or distant, pause to notice. What am I feeling in my body right now? What emotions are arising? What stories am I telling myself about what's happening? This multi-leveled listening often reveals resistance patterns that pure intellectual analysis would miss. The environments we create and inhabit also reflect and reinforce our resistance patterns. If you tend toward control, you might maintain a meticulously organized space that allows little room for spontaneity. If avoidance is a core pattern, your environment might enable distraction through constant access to technology. By listening to how your surroundings either challenge or reinforce your patterns, you can make conscious choices about the contexts that support your growth. Creative expression offers another pathway for both recognizing and releasing resistance patterns. Activities like writing, movement, drawing, or singing often bypass our usual defenses, revealing patterns that remain hidden to direct observation. Even if you don't consider yourself artistic, simple creative practices can access wisdom that logical analysis alone cannot reach. The key is approaching these activities with curiosity rather than judgment about the outcome. Working with resistance patterns is inherently challenging because these patterns are designed to protect us from perceived threat. When we begin to release them, it's natural to experience vulnerability, uncertainty, and even grief for the familiar ways of being we are outgrowing. These emotions aren't signs of failure, but integral aspects of authentic growth. By listening to this vulnerability with compassion, we develop the inner resources needed to sustain meaningful change. Releasing resistance doesn't mean eliminating all structure or boundaries in our lives. In fact, consciously chosen structures often create the very conditions that allow us to work skillfully with resistance. Regular practices of reflection, supportive relationships, and environments that encourage growth provide the foundation for sustainable transformation. The goal isn't to become infinitely flexible, but rather consciously responsive rather than automatically reactive. As we deepen our capacity to listen to resistive patterns, we often discover something surprising. Resistance itself becomes a valuable teacher. The very patterns that once seemed like obstacles reveal important information about our core values, deepest fears, and authentic needs. By listening to resistance with curiosity rather than judgment, we access the wisdom within these patterns, even as we create space for new opportunities. Many people approach resistance patterns with harsh self-judgment, seeing them as flaws to be eliminated. This judgment actually reinforces the underlying pattern by creating another layer of resistance to resistance. A more effective approach involves bringing genuine curiosity and compassion to these patterns, recognizing them as natural adaptations to past circumstances rather than personal failings. Ultimately, the practice of listening to and gradually releasing patterns of resistance isn't about achieving some ideal state of perpetual openness. It's about developing the capacity to recognize when resistance is arising, understand its message, and make conscious choices about how to respond. This growing flexibility creates space for more authentic self-expression and deeper connection with others. Finally, I'd like to offer a simple practice for working with resistance patterns in daily life. Each evening, take a few minutes to reflect on moments from your day when you notice resistance arising. Approach these reflections with curious attention rather than judgment. What triggered the resistance? How did it manifest in your body, emotions, thoughts, and behaviors? This simple practice of reflective listening gradually builds your capacity to recognize patterns as they emerge. What makes this work of releasing resistance so worthwhile is that it gradually frees energy that was previously bound to maintaining protective patterns. Many people report feeling more vitality, creativity, and presence as they learn to work skillfully with resistance. The energy once used to avoid, control, or judge can be redirected towards what truly matters to you. Thank you for joining me today. In our next episode, we'll build on these ideas by exploring how listening practices can help us access our innate creativity, particularly during times when we feel blocked or uninspired. If you found value in this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend who might also find it interesting. Your support helps us continue to create this space for learning and growth. You can find out more about our studio and the podcast at chirising.studio.